Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty interesting. Uh, we're looking at this collection of text in Hindi, and it seems to have a particular focus on Ramadan and Islamic ideas.
Yeah, you've got a really interesting set of sources here. They offer some, pretty unique perspectives on Ramadan, and actually, they even bring in ideas from other texts too, like the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, and that's what really caught my eye. We're going to kind of unpack what these sources are saying about Ramadan, the practices involved, and maybe most interestingly, like the different view they present on Allah.
Right, and it looks like they're really trying to connect, these Islamic concepts with ideas from other religious traditions and sort of explore those overlaps and maybe even some contradictions.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to really dig into the core arguments these sources are making and tease out the nuances.
Yeah, and I'm particularly curious about how they're weaving together, these different interpretations of Allah and these related spiritual concepts.
Okay, well, the text kind of starts by laying out the basics, introducing Ramadan as the ninth month of the Islamic calendar and describing it as extremely, holy.
Right, the text uses the Hindi word pavitra, which, yeah, basically translates to holy or sacred.
And then it jumps right into, the key practices that Muslims observe during this month.
Yeah, it goes through, the daily fasting, the special prayers at night, the emphasis on praying for the well-being of the entire community, and the giving of charity, which is known as zakat.
Of course, it mentions the belief that, the Quran was revealed during this month,
Hmm.
making it even more, significant.
Right, this month is seen as like this incredibly, spiritually potent time for Muslims, and it's interesting how they highlight this connection between Ramadan and the revelation of the Quran.
And there's even a mention of, the pre-dawn meal, the seri, and the importance of dates. And, then they talk about breaking the fast together in the evening after prayers.
Yeah, there's this real sense of, community and shared experience that comes through in the text's description of Ramadan.
It's almost like a festival in a way, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's crucial to note that the text also links Ramadan to, the five pillars of Islam.
Right. It accurately points out that, fasting during Ramadan is considered the fifth pillar, right up there with prayer, charity, faith,
Yeah.
and the pilgrimage to Mecca.
So these are like the foundational practices of the Islamic faith, the absolute essentials.
But then here's where things start to get really interesting. The text kind of throws a curveball
Yeah.
and brings in the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They quote from the Gita. And basically, it seems like it's saying that fasting might actually be a kind of pointless practice.
Yeah, it's almost like they're saying it doesn't really, please the divine in the way that some people might think.
So it's a really thought-provoking contrast, right? Like these two different perspectives on the whole concept of self-discipline and, connecting with the divine.
Absolutely. And it's kind of setting the stage for this recurring theme in the text, this idea that, just doing these outward rituals might not be the whole story when it comes to spiritual fulfillment.
Right. It's like they're encouraging us to, question the real purpose and the actual effectiveness of religious practices across different traditions.
Okay, so moving on, the text then starts to focus on, Allah and this concept of Allahu Akbar Kabir.
Yeah, and they actually raise this question like, who is this Allah the Greatest, truly? It's like they're hinting that there might be more to it than meets the eye.
Exactly. And then they get really specific and they bring in verses from the Quran.
Oh, yeah. They reference Surah Furqan, chapter 25, verses 52 through 59.
Okay, so for our listeners who might not be, intimately familiar with the Quran, that particular surah is all about, discerning truth from falsehood.
Right. It's about recognizing what's genuine and what's not.
And the way the text interprets these verses, it's suggesting that you need to seek out a bakabar.
Yeah, Bakabar is like a knowledgeable or well-informed saint, someone with a much deeper understanding of things.
Yeah, it's almost like they're talking about someone with this, esoteric knowledge beyond what you might get from a typical religious scholar.
Right, someone who can really guide you to the true way of worshiping Allah.
And if you connect this back to, the broader argument the text is making, it's like they're implying that maybe just understanding Allah through, traditional interpretations of the Quran might not be enough.
Yeah, it's like they're saying you need this guide, this Bakabar, who has this deeper experiential knowledge to really grasp the true nature of the divine.
And then they drop this, pretty significant claim about Kabir. They're saying that Kabir is actually the creator of the whole universe.
Right, they say he created everything in 6 days and then ascended to his throne.
which, is a pretty different take on the creation of the cosmos than what you might find in some mainstream Islamic beliefs.
Exactly, and this is where the concept of a bakabar sant comes in.
Yeah, they're basically saying this is an enlightened saint, someone who possesses the true knowledge of Allah.
Right, knowledge that goes beyond the conventional religious understanding.
And then they actually introduce Sant Rampalji Maharaj as the current Bakabar.
Yeah, and they claim that he's provided all this evidence from different religious scriptures to prove that, the supreme being is actually Kabir Dev.
And they even go on to say that Kabir Dev is also known by other names like Allahu Akbar Rab and God.
So it's a very specific theological claim they're making here.
Absolutely. And, it's important to remember that this is just one particular interpretation.
Right.
And it might not line up with the beliefs held by, the majority of Muslims.
Right. It's important to be aware of the context and to understand that this source is advocating for a specific understanding of Islamic scripture and the identity of the divine.
Right. So then they delve into an interpretation of Quran 25.58. And they suggest that it's actually advising belief in this Kabir Paramatma, who supposedly appeared to Prophet Muhammad as a living saint.
Right. And they describe Kabir as imperishable or eternal.
So they're basically arguing that the Quran itself is pointing towards Kabir as the ultimate reality.
And this interpretation really hinges on, the specific meaning they're giving to the words in the verse and on identifying Kabir as this imperishable being.
And then they move on to Surah Furqan 25.59, and they attribute the creation of the universe in 6 days and the subsequent enthronement to Kabir.
Right, so they're using these Quranic verses to really build up this narrative about Kabir as the supreme being.
It's really fascinating how they're weaving together these different scriptural references to support their argument.
Yeah, and it's important to point out that this is a very specific interpretation of these verses.
Okay, so then the deep dive shifts to the role of Prophet Muhammad and the Quran itself.
Right, and they start by giving this brief biography of the prophet, highlighting some of the hardships he faced early on in his life.
Yeah, they mention the loss of his parents and grandfather and also the deaths of his sons.
Right, they really emphasize these challenges and periods of suffering in his life.
And then they move on to the traditional story of Prophet Muhammad receiving the knowledge of the Quran through the angel Jibril.
But they add a pretty significant twist to it.
Yeah, they emphasize that this revelation was actually forceful and even kind of frightening.
Right, and this becomes a really key point in their argument.
Yeah, they're basically saying that this forceful revelation means that the knowledge of the Quran didn't come from the supreme being Kabir.
Instead, they're suggesting it came from Kal Brahm.
And they describe Kal Brahm as this destructive aspect of God, which is distinct from Kabir.
Right, so they're drawing this contrast between a benevolent, compassionate God and this other, more forceful, maybe even intimidating source of revelation.
Yeah, and the idea is that a truly loving God wouldn't use fear or force to impart knowledge.
It's a pretty significant reinterpretation of Islamic tradition.
Then they make this really extraordinary claim that Prophet Muhammad was actually taken to Satlok by Kabir himself.
And Satlok is described as this eternal abode.
And they're saying that while he was there, he was shown the true reality.
But then he supposedly came back to Earth and ended up going back to what they consider incorrect spiritual practices.
And they say this was because of the large number of his followers and, maybe a desire for respect.
It's a pretty unconventional interpretation of Prophet Muhammad's spiritual journey.
And to support this claim, they bring in some poetic verses that are attributed to Kabir.
And in these verses, Kabir mentions taking Muhammad to his abode and giving him practices like Roza Bang and namaz.
But notably, they say there's no mention of Bismil.
Right. Bismil refers to slaughtering animals in the name of Allah.
So they're suggesting that, these fundamental Islamic practices were given by Kabir, but animal sacrifice was not part of that original divine instruction.
Right. They're drawing a line between those practices.
So this naturally leads us to the whole topic of the Islamic view on meat consumption.
Right. And the text kind of starts by laying out, the common Muslim practice of eating meat that's been slaughtered in Allah's name.
And they mention the festival of Bakrid, or Eid al-Adha, which involves animal sacrifice.
Yeah, so they accurately describe these widely observed practices.
But then they introduce this really strong contrasting perspective.
Right. They basically say that all living beings are equal in the eyes of God and that killing any creature is a sin.
And they're very clear that it doesn't matter how the animal is slaughtered, even if it's done according to the halal method.
They're really emphasizing this ethical argument against killing.
They even ask this rhetorical question like, would parents be happy if one of their children killed another child?
Right. It's a pretty powerful analogy.
And it's meant to highlight the seeming contradiction of worshiping a compassionate God while also practicing animal sacrifice.
Yeah, they're really trying to make you question how those two things can coexist.
And they also address the belief that, the soul of an animal goes straight to heaven if it's slaughtered while reciting the Kalma.
Right, and they point out that if that's true, then why wouldn't humans want to be slaughtered too if heaven is so great?
It's like they're pointing out these inconsistencies in the logic.
Yeah, they're challenging the reasoning behind that belief.
And to further support their argument against meat consumption, they bring in verses attributed to Garib Das Ji Maharaj.
And these verses claim that Prophet Muhammad himself didn't kill animals or eat meat.
They even tell a story about him bringing a cow back to life with his spiritual power, but never eating its meat.
It's like they're using these anecdotal accounts to say, look, this is how the prophet actually lived his life.
And they interpret the current practice of killing cows to commemorate that revival as, a misinterpretation of the original event.
And they say it's actually a sin.
Right. So they're taking a strong stance against animal slaughter.
And they go back to those verses attributed to Kabir and they say, look, Rosa Bang and Namaz were prescribed, but Bismol was not.
Right. So again, they're making a distinction between those facts.
Okay, so then the text shifts gears and starts talking about the true Jannat, or paradise.
And they pose this question like, where is this real heaven located, and how do you actually achieve forgiveness for your sins?
Right, so they're moving on to this whole question of salvation and the afterlife.
And they state their belief that only Allah Kabir can forgive sins, and that you can only reach him through the guidance of the Bakabar.
Right, so that enlightened Saint Rampal Ji Maharaj becomes the key figure here.
They're saying he's the only one who can show you the true path.
Right, and they go on to say that all souls originally lived in Satlok, which is the eternal abode where Kabir took Prophet Muhammad.
So it's like they're establishing Satlok as the ultimate spiritual home for everyone.
Right, this place beyond the cycle of birth and death.
And they interpret some verses from the Quran in a really interesting way.
Yeah, they talk about Surah Ashura, chapter 42, verses 1 and 2.
And they focus on those three sets of letters. Ha-Mim Ayin Kaf.
Right, and they claim that these letters are actually connected to the Om Tat Sat from the Bhagavad Gita.
And they really emphasize that you need a Bakabar to properly understand the hidden meaning of these words.
It's like they're saying there's this deeper esoteric layer to the Quran.
Exactly. So then they move on to the concept of reincarnation.
Right, and they interpret some verses from the Quran as evidence for the idea of rebirth.
They talk about Surah Al-Baqarah 2.243, which describes Allah causing death and then giving life again.
And they also bring up Surah Ar-Rum 30.11, which says that Allah initiates creation and then repeats it.
So they're presenting these verses as proof that reincarnation is part of Islamic scripture.
Right, they're saying it's right there in the Quran.
And then they talk about connections between Islam and other religions.
Right, they claim that the giver of knowledge for the Quran, the Bible, the Zabur, the Torah, and the Injil is actually the same Allah.
And they cite a verse from the Quran to back this up, Surah Al-Mu'minun 23.49.
So they're suggesting this underlying unity between these Abrahamic faiths.
And they even quote from the Sushma Veda, which links Muhammad to figures like Shiva Adam and Brahma.
Yeah, it's a really interesting interpretation. They're saying that Prophet Muhammad was a pious soul from Shiva's realm and that he received a message from a Rudra, which they equate with the angel Jibril.
It's like they're trying to find these common threads between Islam and Hinduism.
Right, and then they bring in a claim from the Sikh text, Pai Bal Wali Janam Saki.
And this claim states that Mecca was originally a temple of Shiva built by a Brahmin king.
And that it was later rebuilt by Prophet Ibrahim and Hazrat Ismail.
So it's another attempt to connect Islamic holy sites to earlier religious traditions.
Right. It's like they're weaving together this tapestry of interconnectedness.
Okay, so then they touch on some of the prohibitions and teachings in the Quran.
Yeah, they mention things like the prohibition of alcohol and gambling.
Right, and they also highlight the teaching against taking interest.
And they cite the specific verses in the Quran where these things are mentioned.
So finally we come to the nature of God, or Allah.
Right, and they quote a verse from Surah As-Sajda 32.4.
Which talks about Allah creating the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then establishing himself on the throne.
And it emphasizes that there are no intercessors besides him.
So they're using this verse to reinforce the idea of Allah as the ultimate creator and ruler.
Right, the one and only.
And then they reference the book Fazali Amal, and they claim that there are verses in it that glorify Kabir Allah.
So again, they're trying to connect the name Kabir to the divine within Islamic literature.
And they reiterate that verse from Surah Furqan 25:5-9, where Prophet Muhammad is told to ask a Bakabar about the creation of the universe.
Right, they keep coming back to this idea that you need a true spiritual guide to understand these things.
And they finish up by quoting Surah Furqan 25.58, where Allah tells Prophet Muhammad to trust in the imperishable Kabir.
Yeah, so they bring it all back to Kabir as the ultimate authority.
It's really interesting how they've woven together all these different strands of thought.
Yeah, so basically this deep dive has taken us through the practices and significance of Ramadan, but it's also given us these really alternative perspectives on Allah and the Quran.
And it's really challenged us to think about, meat consumption in Islam.
Yeah.
The idea of paradise and the path to get there, and even the concept of reincarnation.
Right, and they've even brought in connections to other faiths like Hinduism and Sikhism.
And throughout it all, the Bakabar Sant, Sanrapal Ji Maharaj, is presented as this essential figure.
Yeah, they're saying he's the one who holds the key to unlocking the true understanding of Allah, or Kabir, as they call him.
So I think this deep dive really highlights the fact that, there could be so many different interpretations of religious texts, even when it comes to the most fundamental beliefs.
Right, it's really eye-opening.
And it makes you wonder, what other hidden knowledge might be out there, and what role do these spiritual guides play in helping us to uncover it?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
So maybe our listeners will be inspired to, go and do some more research on Kabir or the concept of the Bakabar.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic.
Well, thanks for sharing these sources and for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
All right. Until next time, folks, keep diving.
Take care.